Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Read by Hannah Dormor.
Section 21. How nice it must be, she said, in the country, struggling, as Mr. Whittaker had told her, with that violent grudge against the world which had scorned her, sneered at her, cast her off, beginning with this indignity, the infliction of her unlovable body which people could not bear to see. Do her hair as she might, her forehead remained like an egg, bald, white. No clothes suited her. She might buy anything. And for a woman, of course, that meant never meeting the opposite sex. Never would she come first with anyone. Sometimes lately it had seemed to her that, except for Elizabeth, her food was all that she lived for, her comforts, her dinner, her tea, her hot water bottle at night. But one must fight, vanquish, have faith in God. Mr. Whittaker had said she was there for a purpose. But no one knew the agony. He said, pointing to the crucifix, that God knew. But why should she have to suffer when other women like Clarissa Dalloway escaped? Knowledge comes through suffering, said Mr. Whittaker. She had passed the pillar box, and Elizabeth had turned into the cool brown tobacco department of the Army and Navy stores while she was still muttering to herself what Mr. Whittaker had said about knowledge coming through suffering into the flesh. The flesh, she muttered. What department did she want? Elizabeth interrupted her. Petticoats, she said abruptly, and stalked straight onto the lift. Up they went. Elizabeth guided her this way and that, guided her in her abstraction as if she had been a great child, an unwieldy battleship. There were the petticoats, brown, decorous, striped, frivolous, solid, flimsy, and she chose, in her abstraction, portentously, and the girl serving thought her mad. Elizabeth rather wondered, as they did up the parcel, what Miss Kilman was thinking. They must have their tea, said Miss Kilman, rousing, collecting herself. They had their tea. Elizabeth rather wondered whether Miss Kilman could be hungry. It was her way of eating with intensity, then looking again and again at a plate of sugared cakes on the table next them. Then, when a lady and a child sat down and the child took the cake, could Miss Kilman really mind it? Yes, Miss Kilman did mind it. She had wanted that cake, the pink one. The pleasure of eating was almost the only pure pleasure left her, and then to be baffled even in that. When people are happy, they have a reserve, she had told Elizabeth, upon which to draw, whereas she was like a wheel without a tire. She was fond of such metaphors. Jolted by every pebble, so she would say, staying on after the lesson, standing by the fireplace with her bag of books, her satchel, she called it, on a Tuesday morning, after the lesson was over. And she talked too about the war. After all, there were people who did not think the English invariably right. There were books. There were meetings. There were other points of view. Would Elizabeth like to come with her to listen to so-and-so, a most extraordinary-looking old man? Then Miss Kilman took her to some church in Kensington, and they had tea with a clergyman. She had lent her books, law, medicine, politics. All professions are open to women of your generation, said Miss Kilman. But for herself, her career was absolutely ruined, and was it her fault? Good gracious, said Elizabeth, no. And her mother would come calling to say that a hamper had come from Burton, and would Miss Kilman like some flowers. To Miss Kilman she was always very, very nice. But Miss Kilman squashed the flowers all in a bunch, and hadn't any small talk, and what interested Miss Kilman bored her mother, and Miss Kilman and she were terrible together, and Miss Kilman swelled and looked very plain. But then Miss Kilman was frightfully clever. Elizabeth had never thought about the poor. They lived with everything they wanted. Her mother had breakfast in bed every day. Lucy carried it up, and she liked old women because they were duchesses, and being descended from some lord. But Miss Kilman said, one of those Tuesday mornings when the lesson was over, "My grandfather kept an oil and colour shop in Kensington." Miss Kilman made one feel so small. Miss Kilman took another cup of tea. Elizabeth, with her oriental bearing, her inscrutable mystery, sat perfectly upright. No, she did not want anything more. She looked for her gloves, her white gloves. They were under the table. Ah, but she must not go. Miss Kilman could not let her go. This youth that was so beautiful, this girl whom she genuinely loved. Her large hand opened and shut on the table. But perhaps it was a little flat somehow, Elizabeth felt, and really she would like to go. But, said Miss Kilman, I've not quite finished yet. Of course, then, Elizabeth would wait. But it was rather stuffy in here. "Are you going to the party tonight?" Miss Kilman said. Elizabeth supposed she was going. Her mother wanted her to go. She must not let parties absorb her, Miss Kilman said, fingering the last 2 inches of a chocolate eclair. She did not much like parties, Elizabeth said. Miss Kilman opened her mouth, slightly projected her chin, and swallowed down the last inches of the chocolate eclair, then wiped her fingers and washed the tea round in her cup. She was about to split asunder, she felt. The agony was so terrific. If she could grasp her, if she could clasp her, if she could make her hers absolutely and forever and then die, that was all she wanted. But to sit here, unable to think of anything to say, to see Elizabeth turning against her, to be felt repulsive even by her, it was too much. She could not stand it. The thick fingers curled inwards. "I never go to parties," said Miss Kilman, "just to keep Elizabeth from going. People don't ask me to parties." And she knew as she said it that it was this egotism that was her undoing. Mr. Whittaker had warned her, but she could not help it. She had suffered so horribly. "Why should they ask me?" she said. "I'm plain. I'm unhappy." She knew it was idiotic, but it was all those people passing, people with parcels who despised her, who made her say it. However, she was Doris Kilman. She had her degree. She was a woman who had made her way in the world. Her knowledge of modern history was more than respectable. "I don't pity myself," she said. "I pity—" She meant to say your mother, but no, she could not to Elizabeth. "I pity other people," she said. "More." Like some dumb creature who has been brought up to a gate for an unknown purpose, and stands there longing to gallop away, Elizabeth Dalloway sat silent. Was Miss Kilman going to say anything more? "Don't quite forget me," said Doris Kilman. Her voice quivered. Right away to the end of the field the dumb creature galloped in terror. The great hand opened and shut. Elizabeth turned her head. The waitress came. "One had to pay at the desk," Elizabeth said, and went off, drawing out, so Miss Kilman felt, the very entrails in her body, stretching them as she crossed the room, and then, with a final twist, bowing her head very politely, she went. She had gone. Miss Kilman sat at the marble table among the eclairs, stricken once, twice, thrice by shocks of suffering. She had gone. Mrs. Dalloway had triumphed. Elizabeth had gone. Beauty had gone. Youth had gone. So she sat. She got up, blundered off among the little tables, rocking slightly from side to side, and somebody came after her with her petticoat, and she lost her way, and was hemmed in by trunks specially prepared for taking to India. Next got among the accouchement sets and baby linen. Through all the commodities of the world, perishable and permanent, hams, drugs, flowers, stationery, variously smelling, now sweet, now sour, she lurched, saw herself thus lurching with her hat askew, very red in the face, full length in a looking-glass, and at last came out into the street. The tower of Westminster Cathedral rose in front of her, the habitation of God. In the midst of the traffic there was the habitation of God. Doggedly she set off with her parcel to that other sanctuary, the Abbey, where, raising her hands in a tent before her face, she sat beside those driven into shelter too. The variously assorted worshippers, now divested of social rank, almost of sex, as they raised their hands before their faces, but once they removed them, instantly reverent, middle-class, English men and women, some of them desirous of seeing the waxworks. But Miss Kilman held her tent before her face. Now she was deserted, now rejoined. New worshippers came in from the street to replace the strollers, and still, as people gazed round and shuffled past the tomb of the unknown warrior, still she barred her eyes with her fingers and tried, in this double darkness, for the light in the Abbey was bodiless, to aspire above the vanities, the desires, the commodities, to rid herself both of hatred and of love. Her hands twitched. She seemed to struggle. Yet to others God was accessible, and the path to him smooth. Mr. Fletcher, retired, of the Treasury, Mrs. Gorham, widow of the famous K.C., approached him simply, and having done their praying, leant back, enjoyed the music, the organ pealed sweetly, and saw Miss Kilman at the end of the row, praying, and being still on the threshold of their underworld, thought of her sympathetically as a soul haunting the same territory, a soul cut out of immaterial substance, not a woman, a soul. But Mr. Fletcher had to go. He had to pass her, and being himself neat as a new pin, could not help being a little distressed by the poor lady's disorder, her hair down, her parcel on the floor. She did not at once let him pass. But as he stood gazing about him at the white marbles, grey window panes, and accumulated treasures, for he was extremely proud of the Abbey, her largeness, robustness, and power as she sat there shifting her knees from time to time, it was so rough the approach to her God, so tough her desires, impressed him as they had impressed Mrs. Dalloway. She could not get the thought of her out of her mind that afternoon. The Reverend Edward Whittaker, and Elizabeth too. And Elizabeth waited in Victoria Street for an omnibus. It was so nice to be out of doors. She thought perhaps she need not go home just yet. It was so nice to be out in the air. So she would get on to an omnibus. And already, even as she stood there in her very well-cut clothes, it was beginning. People were beginning to compare her to poplar trees, early dawn, hyacinths, fawns, running water, and garden lilies, and it made her life a burden to her, for she so much preferred being left alone to do what she liked in the country. But they would compare her to lilies, and she had to go to parties, and London was so dreary compared with being alone in the country with her father and the dogs. Buses swooped, settled, were off. Garish caravans, glistening with red and yellow varnish. But which should she get on to? She had no preferences. Of course she would not push her way. She inclined to be passive. It was expression she needed, but her eyes were fine, Chinese, Oriental, and as her mother said, with such nice shoulders and holding herself so straight, she was always charming to look at. And lately, in the evening especially, when she was interested, for she never seemed excited, she looked almost beautiful, very stately, very serene. What could she be thinking? Every man fell in love with her, and she was really awfully bored. For it was beginning. Her mother could see that. The compliments were beginning. That she did not care more about it, for instance, for her clothes, sometimes worried Clarissa. But perhaps it was as well with all these puppies and guinea pigs about, having distemper, and it gave her a charm. And now there was this odd friendship with Miss Kilman. Well, thought Clarissa about 3 o'clock in the morning, reading Baron Marbo, for she could not sleep, it proves she has a heart. End of section 21. Section 22. Suddenly Elizabeth stepped forward and most competently boarded the omnibus, in front of everybody. She took a seat on top. The impetuous creature, a pirate, started forward, sprang away. She had to hold the rail to steady herself, for a pirate it was, reckless, unscrupulous, bearing down ruthlessly, circumventing dangerously, boldly snatching a passenger or ignoring a passenger, squeezing eel-like and arrogant in between, and then rushing insolently, all sails spread, up Whitehall. And did Elizabeth give one thought to poor Miss Kilman, who loved her without jealousy, to whom she had been a fawn in the open, a moon in a glade? She was delighted to be free. The fresh air was so delicious. It had been so stuffy in the Army and Navy stores, and now it was like riding, to be rushing up Whitehall, and to each movement of the omnibus the beautiful body in the fawn-coloured coat responded freely like a rider, like the figurehead of a ship. For the breeze slightly disarrayed her, the heat gave her cheeks the pallor of white-painted wood, and her fine eyes, having no eyes to meet, gazed ahead, blank, bright, with the staring, incredible innocence of sculpture. It was always talking about her own sufferings that made Miss Kilman so difficult. And was she right? If it was being on committees and giving up hours and hours every day, she hardly ever saw him in London, that helped the poor. Her father did that, goodness knows. If that was what Miss Kilman meant about being a Christian. But it was so difficult to say. Oh, she would like to go a little further. Another penny, was it, to the Strand? Here was another penny, then. She would go up the Strand. She liked people who were ill, and every profession is open to the women of your generation, said Miss Kilman. So she might be a doctor. She might be a farmer. Animals are often ill. She might own 1,000 acres and have people under her. She would go and see them in their cottages. This was Somerset House. One might be a very good farmer, and that, strangely enough, though Miss Kilman had her share in it, was almost entirely due to Somerset House. It looked so splendid, so serious, that great grey building, and she liked the feeling of people working. She liked those churches, like shapes of grey paper, breasting the stream of the Strand. It was quite different here from Westminster, she thought, getting off at Chancery Lane. It was so serious, it was so busy. In short, she would like to have a profession. She would become a doctor, a farmer, possibly go into Parliament if she found it necessary, all because of the Strand. The feet of those people busy about their activities, hands putting stone to stone, minds eternally occupied, not with trivial chatterings, comparing women to poplars, which was rather exciting, of course, but very silly, but with thoughts of ships, of business, of law, of administration, and with it all so stately. She was in the Temple, gay, there was the river, pious, there was the church, made her quite determined, whatever her mother might say, to become either a farmer or a doctor. But she was, of course, rather lazy, and it was much better to say nothing about it. It seemed so silly. It was the sort of thing that did sometimes happen when one was alone. Buildings without architects' names, crowds of people coming back from the city having more power than single clergymen in Kensington, than any of the books Miss Kilman had lent her, to stimulate what lay slumberous, clumsy, and shy on the mind's sandy floor to break surface, as a child suddenly stretches its arms. It was just that, perhaps, a sigh, a stretch of the arms, an impulse, a revelation, which has its effects forever, and then down again it went to the sandy floor. She must go home. She must dress for dinner. But what was the time? Where was a clock? She looked up Fleet Street. She walked just a little way towards St. Paul's, shyly, like someone penetrating on tiptoe, exploring a strange house by night with a candle, on edge lest the owner should suddenly fling wide his bedroom door and ask her business. Nor did she dare wander off into queer alleys, tempting by-streets, any more than in a strange house open doors which might be bedroom doors, or sitting-room doors, or lead straight to the larder. For no Dalloways came down the Strand daily. She was a pioneer, a stray, venturing, trusting. In many ways, her mother felt, she was extremely immature, like a child still, attached to dolls, to old slippers, a perfect baby, and that was charming. But then, of course, there was in the Dalloway family the tradition of public service, abbesses, principals, headmistresses, dignitaries, in the Republic of Women, without being brilliant, any of them. They were that. She penetrated a little further in the direction of St. Paul's. She liked the geniality, sisterhood, motherhood, brotherhood of this uproar. It seemed to her good. The noise was tremendous, and suddenly there were trumpets, the unemployed, blaring, rattling about in the uproar, military music, as if people were marching. Yet had they been dying? Had some woman breathed her last, and whoever was watching, opening the window of the room where she had just brought off that act of supreme dignity, looked down on Fleet Street, that uproar, that military music would have come triumphing up to him, consolatory, indifferent. It was not conscious. There was no recognition in it of one fortune or fate, and for that very reason, even to those dazed with watching for the last shivers of consciousness on the faces of the dying, consoling. Forgetfulness in people might wound, their ingratitude corrode, but this voice, pouring endlessly year in, year out, would take whatever it might be, this vow, this van, this life, this procession, would wrap them all about and carry them on, as in the rough stream of a glacier the ice holds a splinter of bone, a blue petal, some oak trees, and rolls them on. But it was later than she thought. Her mother would not like her to be wandering off alone like this. She turned back down the Strand. A puff of wind, in spite of the heat there was quite a wind, blew a thin black veil over the sun and over the Strand. The faces faded, the omnibuses suddenly lost their glow. For although the clouds were of mountainous white so that one could fancy hacking hard chips off with a hatchet, with broad golden slopes, lawns of celestial pleasure gardens on their flanks, and had all the appearance of settled habitations assembled for the conference of gods above the world, there was a perpetual movement among them. Signs were interchanged when, as if to fulfil some scheme arranged already, now a summit dwindled. Now a whole block of pyramidal size which had kept its station inalterably advanced into the midst or gravely led the procession to fresh anchorage. Fixed though they seemed at their posts, at rest in perfect unanimity, nothing could be fresher, freer, more sensitive superficially than the snow-white or gold-kindled surface. To change, to go, to dismantle the solemn assemblage was immediately possible. And in spite of the grave fixity, the accumulated robustness and solidity, now they struck light to the earth, now darkness. Calmly and competently, Elizabeth Dalloway mounted the Westminster omnibus. Going and coming, beckoning, signalling, so the light and shadow which now made the wall grey, now the bananas bright yellow, now made the Strand grey, now made the omnibuses bright yellow, seemed to Septimus Warren-Smith lying on the sofa in the sitting-room, watching the watery gold glow and fade with the astonishing sensibility of some live creature on the roses, on the wallpaper. Outside, the trees dragged their leaves like nets through the depths of the air. The sound of water was in the room, and through the waves came the voices of birds singing. Every power poured its treasures on his head, and his hand lay there on the back of the sofa, as he had seen his hand lie when he was bathing, floating, on the top of the waves, while far away on shore he heard dogs barking and barking far away. "Fear no more," says the heart in the body, "fear no more." He was not afraid. At every moment nature signified by some laughing hint, like that gold spot which went round the wall, there, her determination to show, by brandishing her plumes, shaking her tresses, flinging her mantle this way and that, beautifully, always beautifully, and standing close up to breathe through her hollowed hands Shakespeare's words, her meaning. Risha, sitting at the table, twisting a hat in her hands, watched him, saw him smiling. He was happy then. But she could not bear to see him smiling. It was not marriage. It was not being one's husband to look strange like that, always to be starting, laughing, sitting hour after hour silent, or clutching her and telling her to write. The table drawer was full of those writings, about war, about Shakespeare, about great discoveries, how there is no death. Lately he had become excited suddenly for no reason, and both Dr. Holmes and Sir William Bradshaw said excitement was the worst thing for him, and waved his hands and cried out that he knew the truth, he knew everything. That man, his friend who was killed, Evans, had come, he said. He was singing behind the screen. She wrote it down just as he spoke it. Some things were very beautiful, others sheer nonsense. And he was always stopping in the middle, changing his mind, wanting to add something, hearing something new, listening with his hand up. But she heard nothing. And once they found the girl who did the room reading one of these papers in fits of laughter. It was a dreadful pity. For that made Septimus cry out about human cruelty, how they tear each other to pieces. The fallen, he said, they tear to pieces. Holmes is on us, he would say, and he would invent stories about Holmes. Holmes eating porridge, Holmes reading Shakespeare, making himself roar with laughter or rage, for Dr. Holmes seemed to stand for something horrible to him. Human nature, he called him. Then there were the visions. He was drowned, he used to say, and lying on a cliff with the gulls screaming over him. He would look over the edge of the sofa down into the sea. Or he was hearing music. Really it was only a barrel organ or some man crying in the street. But lovely, he used to cry, and the tears would run down his cheeks, which was to her the most dreadful thing of all, to see a man like Septimus, who had fought, who was brave, crying. And he would lie listening until suddenly he would cry that he was falling down, down into the flames. Actually, she would look for flames. It was so vivid. But there was nothing. They were alone in the room. It was a dream, she would tell him, and so quiet him at last. But sometimes she was frightened too. She sighed as she sat sewing. Her sigh was tender and enchanting, like the wind outside a wood in the evening. Now she put down her scissors. Now she turned to take something from the table. A little stir, a little crinkling, a little tapping built up something on the table there where she sat sewing. Through his eyelashes he could see her blurred outline, her little black body, her face and hands, her turning movements at the table as she took up a reel, or looked, as she was apt to lose things, for her silk. She was making a hat for Mrs. Filmer's married daughter, whose name was... He had forgotten her name. "What is the name of Mrs. Filmer's married daughter?" he asked. "Mrs. Peters," said Risha. She was afraid it was too small, she said, holding it before her. Mrs. Peters was a big woman, but she did not like her. It was only because Mrs. Filmer had been so good to them. "She gave me grapes this morning," she said, that Risha wanted to do something to show that they were grateful. She had come into the room the other evening and found Mrs. Peters, who thought they were out, playing the gramophone. "Was it true?" he asked. She was playing the gramophone? Yes, she had told him about it at the time. She had found Mrs. Peters playing the gramophone. End of section 22. Section 23. He began very cautiously to open his eyes, to see whether a gramophone was really there. But real things were too exciting. He must be cautious. He would not go mad. First he looked at the fashion papers on the lower shelf, then gradually at the gramophone with the green trumpet. Nothing could be more exact. And so, gathering courage, he looked at the sideboard, the plate of bananas, the engraving of Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort, at the mantelpiece with the jar of roses. None of these things moved. All were still. All were real. "She is a woman with a spiteful tongue," said Risha. "What does Mr. Peters do?" Septimus asked. "Ah," said Risha, trying to remember. She thought Mrs. Filmer had said that he travelled for some company. "Just now he is in Hull," she said. Just now, she said that with her Italian accent. She said that herself. He shaded his eyes so that he might see only a little of her face at a time, first the chin, then the nose, then the forehead, in case it were deformed, or had some terrible mark on it. But no, there she was, perfectly natural, sewing, with the pursed lips that women have, the set, the melancholy expression when sewing. But there was nothing terrible about it, he assured himself, looking a second time, a third time at her face, her hands, for what was frightening or disgusting in her as she sat there in broad daylight sewing? Mrs. Peters had a spiteful tongue. Mr. Peters was in Hull. Why then rage and prophesy? Why fly scourged and outcast? Why be made to tremble and sob by the clouds? Why seek truths and deliver messages when Risha sat sticking pins into the front of her dress and Mr. Peters was in Hull? Miracles, revelations, agonies, loneliness, falling through the sea, down, down into the flames, all were burnt out, for he had a sense, as he watched Risha trimming the straw hat for Mrs. Peters, of a coverlet of flowers. "It's too small for Mrs. Peters," said Septimus. For the first time for days he was speaking as he used to do. Of course it was, absurdly small, she said, but Mrs. Peters had chosen it. He took it out of her hands. He said it was an organ-grinder's monkey's hat. How it rejoiced her that. Not for weeks had they laughed like this together, poking fun privately like married people. What she meant was that if Mrs. Filmer had come in, or Mrs. Peters, or anybody, they would not have understood what she and Septimus were laughing at. "There," she said, pinning a rose to one side of the hat. Never had she felt so happy, never in her life. But that was still more ridiculous, Septimus said. Now the poor woman looked like a pig at a fair. Nobody ever made her laugh as Septimus did. What had she got in her workbox? She had ribbons and beads, tassels, artificial flowers. She tumbled them out on the table. He began putting odd colours together, for though he had no fingers, could not even do up a parcel, he had a wonderful eye, and often he was right, sometimes absurd, of course, but sometimes wonderfully right. "She shall have a beautiful hat," he murmured, taking up this and that, Risha kneeling by his side, looking over his shoulder. Now it was finished, that is to say the design, she must stitch it together. But she must be very, very careful, he said, to keep it just as he had made it. So she sewed. When she sewed, he thought, she made a sound like a kettle on the hob, bubbling, murmuring, always busy, her strong little pointed fingers pinching and poking, her needle flashing straight. The sun might go in and out on the tassels, on the wallpaper, but he would wait, he thought, stretching out his feet, looking at his ringed sock at the end of the sofa. He would wait in this warm place, the pocket of still air, which one comes on at the edge of a wood sometimes in the evening, when, because of a fall in the ground or some arrangement of the trees, one must be scientific, above all, scientific. Warmth lingers, and the air buffets the cheek like the wing of a bird. "There it is," said Risha, twirling Mrs. Peters' hat on the tips of her fingers. "That'll do for the moment. Later—" Her sentence bubbled away. Drip, drip, drip. Like a contented tap left running. It was wonderful. Never had he done anything which made him feel so proud. It was so real, it was so substantial, Mrs. Peters' hat. "Just look at it," he said. Yes, it would always make her happy to see that hat. He had become himself then. He had laughed then. They had been alone together. Always she would like that hat. He told her to try it on. "But I must look so queer," she cried, running over to the glass and looking first this side, then that. Then she snatched it off again, for there was a tap at the door. Could it be Sir William Bradshaw? Had he sent already? No, it was only the small girl with the evening paper. What always happened, then happened. What happened every night of their lives. The small girl sucked her thumb at the door, Risha went down on her knees, Risha cooed and kissed, Risha got a bag of sweets out of the table drawer, for so it always happened. First one thing, then another. So she built it up, first one thing and then another. Dancing, skipping, round and round the room they went. He took the paper. Surrey was all out, he read. There was a heat wave, Risha repeated. Surrey was all out. There was a heat wave, making it part of the game she was playing with Mrs. Filmer's grandchild, both of them laughing, chattering at the same time at their game. He was very tired. He was very happy. He would sleep. He shut his eyes. But directly he saw nothing, the sounds of the game became fainter and stranger, and sounded like the cries of people seeking and not finding, and passing further and further away. They had lost him. He started up in terror. What did he see? The plate of bananas on the sideboard. Nobody was there. Risha had taken the child to its mother. It was bedtime. That was it. To be alone forever. That was the doom pronounced in Milan when he came into the room and saw them cutting out buckram shapes with their scissors. To be alone forever. He was alone with the sideboard and the bananas. He was alone, exposed on this black eminence, stretched out, but not on a hilltop, not on a crag, on Mrs. Filmer's sitting-room sofa. As for the visions, the faces, the voices of the dead, where were they? There was a screen in front of him with black bulrushes and blue swallows. Where he had once seen mountains, where he had seen faces, where he had seen beauty, there was a screen. "Evans!" he cried. There was no answer. A mouse had squeaked, or a curtain rustled. Those were the voices of the dead. The screen, the coal scuttle, the sideboard remained to him. Let him then face the screen, the coal scuttle, and the sideboard. But Risha burst into the room, chattering. Some letter had come. Everybody's plans were changed. Mrs. Filmer would not be able to go to Brighton after all. There was no time to let Mrs. Williams know, and really Risha thought it very, very annoying when she caught sight of the hat and thought, perhaps she might just make a little... Her voice died out in contented melody. "Ah, damn!" she cried. It was a joke of theirs, her swearing. The needle had broken. Hat, child, Brighton, needle. She built it up. First one thing, then another. She built it up. Sewing. She wanted him to say whether by moving the rose she had improved the hat. She sat on the end of the sofa. They were perfectly happy now, she said, suddenly, putting the hat down. For she could say anything to him now. She could say whatever came into her head. That was almost the first thing she had felt about him, that night in the cafe when he had come in with his English friends. He had come in rather shyly, looking round him, and his hat had fallen when he hung it up. That she could remember. She knew he was English, though not one of the large Englishmen her sister admired, for he was always thin, but he had a beautiful fresh colour, and with his big nose, his bright eyes, his way of sitting a little hunched made her think, she had often told him, of a young hawk, that first evening she saw him when they were playing dominoes, and he had come in, of a young hawk. But with her he was always very gentle. She had never seen him wild or drunk, only suffering sometimes through this terrible war. But even so, when she came in, he would put it all away. Anything in the whole world, any little bother with her work, anything that struck her to say, she would tell him, and he understood at once. Her own family even were not the same. Being older than she was, and being so clever, how serious he was, wanting her to read Shakespeare before she could even read a child's story in English. Being so much more experienced, he could help her. And she too could help him. But to this hat now. And then it was getting late. Sir William Bradshaw. She held her hands to her head, waiting for him to say, did he like the hat or not? And as she sat there, waiting, looking down, he could feel her mind, like a bird, falling from branch to branch, and always alighting, quite rightly. He could follow her mind as she sat there in one of those loose, lax poses that came to her naturally, and if he should say anything, at once she smiled, like a bird alighting with all its claws firm upon the bough. But he remembered Bradshaw said, "The people we are most fond of are not good for us when we are ill." Bradshaw said he must be taught to rest. Bradshaw said they must be separated. Must. Why must? What power had Bradshaw over him? What right has Bradshaw to say must to me? He demanded. It is because you talked of killing yourself, said Risha. Mercifully, she could now say anything to Septimus. So he was in their power. Holmes and Bradshaw were on him. The brute with the red nostrils was snuffing into every secret place. Must, it could say. Where were his papers, the things he had written? She brought him his papers, the things he had written, things she had written for him. She tumbled them out onto the sofa. They looked at them together. Diagrams, designs, little men and women brandishing sticks for arms with wings, were they, on their backs? Circles traced round shillings and sixpences, the suns and stars, zigzagging precipices with mountaineers ascending, roped together, exactly like knives and forks, sea pieces with little faces laughing out of what might perhaps be waves, the map of the world. Burn them, he cried. Now for his writings, how the dead sing behind rhododendron bushes, odes to time, conversations with Shakespeare, Evans. His messages from the dead. Do not cut down trees. Tell the Prime Minister. Universal love, the meaning of the world. Burn them, he cried. But Risha laid her hands on them. Some were very beautiful, she thought. She would tie them up, for she had no envelope, with a piece of silk. Even if they took him, she said, she would go with him. They could not separate them against their wills, she said. End of section 23. Section 24. Shuffling the edges straight, she did up the papers and tied the parcel almost without looking. Sitting beside him, he thought, as if all her petals were about her. She was a flowering tree, and through her branches looked out the face of a lawgiver, who had reached a sanctuary where she feared no one, not Holmes, not Bradshaw, a miracle, a triumph, the last and greatest. Staggering, he saw her mount the appalling staircase, laden with Holmes and Bradshaw, men who never weighed less than 11 stone 6, who sent their wives to court, men who made 10,000 a year, and talked of proportion, who, different in their verdicts, for Holmes said one thing, Bradshaw another, yet judges they were, who mixed the vision and the sideboard, saw nothing clear, yet ruled, yet inflicted. Must, they said. Over them she triumphed. There, she said. The papers were tied up. No one should get at them. She would put them away, and, she said, nothing should separate them. She sat down beside him and called him by the name of that hawk or crow which, being malicious and a great destroyer of crops, was precisely like him. No one could separate them, she said. Then she got up to go into the bedroom to pack their things, but hearing voices downstairs and thinking that Dr. Holmes had perhaps called, ran down to prevent him coming up. Septimus could hear her talking to Holmes on the staircase. "My dear lady, I have come as a friend," Holmes was saying. "No, I will not allow you to see my husband," she said. He could see her, like a little hen with her wings spread barring his passage, but Holmes persevered. "My dear lady, allow me," Holmes said, putting her aside. Holmes was a powerfully built man. Holmes was coming upstairs. Holmes would burst open the door. Holmes would say, "In a funk, eh?" Holmes would get him. But no, not Holmes, not Bradshaw. Getting up rather unsteadily, hopping indeed from foot to foot, he considered Mrs. Filmer's nice clean bread knife with bread carved on the handle. Ah, but one mustn't spoil that. The gas fire? But it was too late now. Holmes was coming. Razors he might have got, but Risha, who always did that sort of thing, had packed them. There remained only the window, the large Bloomsbury lodging-house window, the tiresome, the troublesome, and rather melodramatic business of opening the window and throwing himself out. It was their idea of tragedy, not his or Risha's, for she was with him. Holmes and Bradshaw liked that sort of thing. He sat on the sill. But he would wait till the very last moment. He did not want to die. Life was good. The sun hot. Only human beings. What did they want? Coming down the staircase opposite, an old man stopped and stared at him. Holmes was at the door. "I'll give it to you," he cried, and flung himself vigorously, violently down onto Mrs. Filmer's area railings. "The coward!" cried Dr. Holmes, bursting the door open. Risha ran to the window. She saw. She understood. Dr. Holmes and Mrs. Filmer collided with each other. Mrs. Filmer flapped her apron and made her hide her eyes in the bedroom. There was a great deal of running up and down stairs. Dr. Holmes came in, white as a sheet, shaking all over, with a glass in his hand. She must be brave and drink something, he said. What was it? Something sweet. For her husband was horribly mangled, would not recover consciousness, she must not see him, must be spared as much as possible, would have the inquest to go through, poor young woman. Who could have foretold it? A sudden impulse, no one was in the least to blame, he told Mrs. Filmer. And why the devil he did it, Dr. Holmes could not conceive. It seemed to her as she drank the sweet stuff that she was opening long windows, stepping out into some garden. But where? The clock was striking. 1, 2, 3. How sensible the sound was, compared with all this thumping and whispering, like Septimus himself. She was falling asleep. But the clock went on striking. 4, 5, 6, and Mrs. Filmer waving her apron, they wouldn't bring the body in here, would they? Seemed part of that garden, or a flag. She had once seen a flag slowly rippling out from a mast when she stayed with her aunt at Venice. Men killed in battle were thus saluted, and Septimus had been through the war. Of her memories, most were happy. She put on her hat and ran through cornfields. Where could it have been? Onto some hill, somewhere near the sea, for there were ships, gulls, butterflies. They sat on a cliff. In London, too, there they sat, and half dreaming came to her through the bedroom door, rain falling, whisperings, stirrings among dry corn, the caress of the sea, as it seemed to her, hollowing them in its arched shell and murmuring to her laid on shore. Strewn, she felt, like flying flowers over some tomb. "He is dead," she said, smiling at the poor old woman who guarded her with the honest light blue eyes fixed on the door. They wouldn't bring him in here, would they? But Mrs. Filmer pooh-poohed. Oh no, they were carrying him away now. Ought she not to be told? Married people ought to be together, Mrs. Filmer thought. But they must do as the doctor said. "Let her sleep," said Dr. Holmes, feeling her pulse. She saw the large outline of his body standing dark against the window. So that was Dr. Holmes. One of the triumphs of civilization, Peter Walsh thought. It is one of the triumphs of civilization, as the light high bell of the ambulance sounded. Swiftly, cleanly, the ambulance sped to the hospital, having picked up instantly, humanely, some poor devil, someone hit on the head, struck down by disease, knocked over perhaps a minute or so ago at one of these crossings, as might happen to oneself. That was civilization. It struck him coming back from the East, the efficiency, the organisation, the communal spirit of London. Every cart or carriage of its own accord drew aside to let the ambulance pass. Perhaps it was morbid, or was it not touching, rather, the respect which they showed this ambulance with its victim inside? Busy men hurrying home, yet instantly bethinking them as it passed of some wife, or presumably how easily it might have been them there, stretched on a shelf with a doctor and a nurse. Ah, but thinking became morbid, sentimental. Directly one began conjuring up doctors, dead bodies, a little glow of pleasure, a sort of lust too over the visual impression warned one not to go on with that sort of thing any more. Fatal to art, fatal to friendship. True. And yet, thought Peter Walsh, as the ambulance turned the corner, though the light high bell could be heard down the next street and still farther as it crossed the Tottenham Court Road, chiming constantly, it is the privilege of loneliness. In privacy one may do as one chooses. One might weep if no one saw. It had been his undoing, this susceptibility, in Anglo-Indian society, not weeping at the right time, or laughing either. I have that in me, he thought, standing by the pillar-box, which could now dissolve in tears. Why, heaven knows. Beauty of some sort, probably, and the weight of the day, which, beginning with that visit to Clarissa, had exhausted him with its heat, its intensity, and the drip, drip of one impression after another down into that cellar where they stood, deep, dark, and no one would ever know. Partly for that reason, its secrecy, complete and inviolable, He had found life like an unknown garden, full of turns and corners, surprising, yes. Really, it took one's breath away, these moments. There, coming to him by the pillar box opposite the British Museum, one of them, a moment in which things came together, this ambulance, and life, and death. It was as if he was sucked up to some very high roof by that rush of emotion, and the rest of him, like a white shell-sprinkled beach, left bare. It had been his undoing in Anglo-Indian society, this susceptibility. Clarissa once, going on top of an omnibus with him somewhere, Clarissa superficially at least, so easily moved, now in despair, now in the best of spirits, all a-quiver in those days, and such good company, spotting queer little scenes, names, people from the top of a bus, for they used to explore London and bring back bags full of treasures from the Caledonian market. Clarissa had a theory in those days. They had heaps of theories, always theories, as young people have. It was to explain the feeling they had of dissatisfaction, not knowing people, not being known. For how could they know each other? You met every day, then not for 6 months or years. It was unsatisfactory, they agreed, how little one knew people. But, she said, sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, she felt herself everywhere, not here, here, here. And she tapped the back of the seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that. So that to know her, or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places. Odd affinities she had with people she had never spoken to. Some woman in the street, some man behind a counter, even trees or barns. It ended in a transcendental theory which, with her horror of death, allowed her to believe, or say that she believed, for all her scepticism, that since our apparitions, the part of us which appears are so momentary compared with the other, the unseen part of us, which spreads wide, the unseen might survive, be recovered somehow attached to this person or that, or even haunting certain places after death. Perhaps. Looking back over that long friendship of almost 30 years, her theory worked to this extent. Brief, broken, often painful, as their actual meetings had been, what with his absences and interruptions. This morning, for instance, in came Elizabeth, like a long-legged colt, handsome, dumb, just as he was beginning to talk to Clarissa. The effect of them on his life was immeasurable. There was a mystery about it. You were given a sharp, acute, uncomfortable grain, the actual meeting, horribly painful as often as not, yet in absence, in the most unlikely places, it would flower out, open, shed its scent, let you touch, taste, look about you, get the whole feel of it and understanding after years of lying lost. Thus she had come to him, on board ship, in the Himalayas, suggested by the oddest things. So Sally Seton, generous, enthusiastic goose, thought of him when she saw blue hydrangeas. She had influenced him more than any person he had ever known. And always in this way, coming before him without his wishing it, cool, ladylike, critical, or ravishing, romantic, recalling some field or English harvest. He saw her most often in the country, not in London. One scene after another at Burton. End of section 24. Section 25. He had reached his hotel. He crossed the hall with its mounds of reddish chairs and sofas, its spike-leaved, withered-looking plants. He got his key off the hook. The young lady handed him some letters. He went upstairs. He saw her most often at Burton in the late summer, when he stayed there for a week or fortnight even, as people did in those days. First on top of some hill, there she would stand, hands clapped to her hair, her cloak blowing out, pointing, crying to them. She saw the 7 beneath. Or in a wood, making the kettle boil, very ineffective with her fingers, the smoke curtsying, blowing in their faces, her little pink face showing through, begging water from an old woman in a cottage, who came to the door to watch them go. They walked always, the others drove. She was bored driving, disliked all animals except that dog. They tramped miles along roads. She would break off to get her bearings, pilot him back across country, and all the time they argued, discussed poetry, discussed people, discussed politics. She was a radical then. Never noticing a thing except when she stopped, cried out at a view or a tree, and made him look with her. And so on again, through stubble fields, she walking ahead with a flower for her aunt, never tired of walking for all her delicacy, to drop down on Burton in the dusk. Then after dinner old Breitkopf would open the piano and sing without any voice, and they would lie sunk in armchairs, trying not to laugh, but always breaking down and laughing at nothing. Breitkopf was supposed not to see, and then in the morning flirting up and down like a wagtail in front of the house. Oh, it was a letter from her! This blue envelope, that was her hand, and he would have to read it. Here was another of those meetings, bound to be painful. To read her letter needed the devil of an effort. How heavenly it was to see him. She must tell him that. That was all. But it upset him. It annoyed him. He wished she hadn't written it. Coming on top of his thoughts, it was like a nudge in the ribs. Why couldn't she let him be? After all, she had married Dalloway and lived with him in perfect happiness all these years. These hotels are not consoling places. Far from it. Any number of people had hung up their hats on those pegs. Even the flies, if you thought of it, had settled on other people's noses. As for the cleanliness which hit him in the face, it wasn't cleanliness so much as bareness, frigidity, a thing that had to be. Some arid matron made her rounds at dawn, sniffing, peering, causing blue-nosed maids to scour, for all the world as if the next visitor were a joint of meat to be served on a perfectly clean platter. For sleep, one bed. For sitting in, one armchair. For cleaning one's teeth and shaving one's chin, one tumbler, one looking-glass. Books, letters, dressing-gowns slipped about on the impersonality of the horsehair like incongruous impertinences. And it was Clarissa's letter that made him see all this. Heavenly to see you. She must say so. He folded the paper, pushed it away. Nothing would induce him to read it again. To get that letter to him by 6 o'clock, she must have sat down and written it directly he left her. Stamped it, sent somebody to the post. It was, as people say, very like her. She was upset by his visit. She had felt a great deal, had, for a moment, when she kissed his hand, regretted, envied him even, remembered possibly, for he saw her look it, something he had said, how they would change the world if she married him, perhaps. Whereas, it was this. It was middle age. It was mediocrity. Then forced herself with her indomitable vitality to put all that aside, there being in her a thread of life which for toughness, endurance, power to overcome obstacles and carry her triumphantly through, he had never known the like of. Yes, but there would come a reaction directly he left the room. She would be frightfully sorry for him. She would think what in the world she could do to give him pleasure, short always of the one thing. And he could see her with the tears running down her cheeks, going to her writing-table and dashing off that one line which he was to find greeting him. Heavenly to see you. And she meant it. Peter Walsh had now unlaced his boots. But it would not have been a success, their marriage. The other thing, after all, came so much more naturally. It was odd. It was true. Lots of people felt it. Peter Walsh, who had done just respectably, filled the usual posts adequately, was liked, but thought a little cranky, gave himself airs. It was odd that he should have had, especially now that his hair was grey, a contented look, a look of having reserves. It was this that made him attractive to women who liked the sense that he was not altogether manly. There was something unusual about him, or something behind him. It might be that he was bookish, never came to see you without taking up the book on the table. He was now reading, with his bootlaces trailing on the floor. Or that he was a gentleman, which showed itself in the way he knocked the ashes out of his pipe, and in his manners, of course, to women. For it was very charming and quite ridiculous how easily some girl without a grain of sense could twist him round her finger, but at her own risk. That is to say, though he might be ever so easy, and indeed with his gaiety and good breeding fascinating to be with, it was only up to a point. She said something. No, he saw through that. He wouldn't stand that. No. Then he could shout and rock and hold his sides together over some joke with men. He was the best judge of cooking in India. He was a man. But not the sort of man one had to respect, which was a mercy, not like Major Simmons, for instance. Not in the least like that, Daisy thought, when, in spite of her 2 small children, she used to compare them. He pulled off his boots. He emptied his pockets. Out came with his pocket-knife a snapshot of Daisy on the veranda, Daisy all in white, with a fox terrier on her knee. Very charming, very dark. The best he had ever seen of her. It did come, after all, so naturally. So much more naturally than Clarissa. No fuss, no bother, no finicking and fidgeting, all plain sailing. And the dark, adorably pretty girl on the veranda exclaimed. He could hear her. Of course she would give him everything, she cried. She had no sense of discretion. Everything he wanted, she cried, running to meet him, whoever might be looking. And she was only 24, and she had 2 children. Well, well. Well, indeed, he had got himself into a mess at his age, and it came over him when he woke in the night pretty forcibly. Suppose they did marry. For him it would be all very well, but what about her? Mrs. Burgess, a good sort and no chatterbox, in whom he had confided, thought this absence of his in England, ostensibly to see lawyers, might serve to make Daisy reconsider, think what it meant. It was a question of her position, Mrs. Burgess said, the social barrier, giving up her children. She'd be a widow with a past one of these days, draggling about in the suburbs, or more likely, indiscriminate. You know, she said, what such women get like, with too much paint. But Peter Walsh pooh-poohed all that. He didn't mean to die yet. Anyhow, she must settle for herself, judge for herself, he thought, padding about the room in his socks, smoothing out his dress shirt, for he might go to Clarissa's party, or he might go to one of the halls, or he might settle in and read an absorbing book written by a man he used to know at Oxford. And if he did retire, that's what he'd do, write books. He would go to Oxford and poke about in the Bodleian. Vainly the dark, adorable, pretty girl ran to the end of the terrace, vainly waved her hand, vainly cried she didn't care a straw what people said. There he was, the man she thought the world of, the perfect gentleman, the fascinating, the distinguished, and his age made not the least difference to her. Padding about a room in an hotel in Bloomsbury, shaving, washing, continuing, as he took up cans, put down razors, to poke about in the Bodleian, and get at the truth about 1 or 2 little matters that interested him. And he would have a chat with whoever it might be, and so come to disregard more and more precise hours for lunch, and miss engagements, and when Daisy asked him, as she would, for a kiss, a scene, fail to come up to the scratch, though he was genuinely devoted to her. In short, it might be happier, as Mrs. Burgess said, that she should forget him, or merely remember him as he was in August 1922, like a figure standing at the crossroads at dusk, which grows more and more remote as the dog-cart spins away, carrying her securely fastened to the back seat, though her arms are outstretched, and as she sees the figure dwindle and disappear, still she cries out how she would do anything in the world, anything, anything, anything. He never knew what people thought. It became more and more difficult for him to concentrate. He became absorbed. He became busied with his own concerns, now surly, now gay, dependent on women, absent-minded, moody, less and less able, so he thought as he shaved, to understand why Clarissa couldn't simply find them a lodging and be nice to Daisy, introduce her. And then he could just do what? Just haunt and hover. He was at the moment actually engaged in sorting out various keys, papers. Swoop and taste, be alone, in short, sufficient to himself. And yet nobody, of course, was more dependent upon others. He buttoned his waistcoat. It had been his undoing. He could not keep out of smoking rooms, liked colonels, liked golf, liked bridge, and above all women's society, and the fineness of their companionship, and their faithfulness and audacity and greatness in loving, which, though it had its drawbacks, seemed to him, and the dark, adorably pretty face was on top of the envelopes, so wholly admirable, so splendid a flower to grow on the crest of human life, and yet he could not come up to the scratch, being always apt to see round things. Clarissa had sapped something in him permanently, and to tire very easily of mute devotion, and to want variety in love, though it would make him furious if Daisy loved anybody else, furious, for he was jealous, uncontrollably jealous by temperament. He suffered tortures. But where was his knife, his watch, his seals, his note-case, and Clarissa's letter, which he would not read again but liked to think of, and Daisy's photograph? And now for dinner. They were eating. Sitting at little tables round vases, dressed or not dressed, with their shawls and bags laid beside them, with their air of false composure, for they were not used to so many courses at dinner, and confidence, for they were able to pay for it, and strain, for they had been running about London all day shopping, sightseeing, and their natural curiosity. for they looked round and up as the nice-looking gentlemen in horn-rimmed spectacles came in, and their good nature, for they would have been glad to do any little service, such as lend a timetable or impart useful information, and their desire, pulsing in them, tugging at them subterraneously, somehow to establish connections, if it were only a birthplace, Liverpool, for example, in common, or friends of the same name, with their furtive glances, odd silences, and sudden withdrawals into family jocularity and isolation. There they sat eating dinner when Mr. Walsh came in and took his seat at a little table by the curtain. It was not that he had said anything, for being solitary he could only address himself to the waiter. It was his way of looking at the menu, of pointing his forefinger to a particular wine, of hitching himself up to the table, of addressing himself seriously, not gluttonously, to dinner, that won him their respect, which, having to remain unexpressed for the greater part of the meal, flared up at the table where the Morrises sat when Mr. Walsh was heard to say at the end of the meal, "Bartlett pears." Why he should have spoken so moderately yet firmly, with the air of a disciplinarian well within his rights, which are founded upon justice, neither young Charles Morris nor old Charles, neither Miss Elaine nor Mrs. Morris knew. But when he said Bartlett pears, sitting alone at his table, they felt that he counted on their support in some lawful demand, was champion of a cause which immediately became their own, so that their eyes met his eyes sympathetically, and when they all reached the smoking-room simultaneously, a little talk between them became inevitable. It was not very profound, only to the effect that London was crowded, had changed in 30 years, that Mr. Morris preferred Liverpool, that Mrs. Morris had been to the Westminster Flower Show, and that they had all seen the Prince of Wales. Yet, thought Peter Walsh, no family in the world could compare with the Morrises, none whatever, and their relations to each other are perfect, and they don't care a hang for the upper classes, and they like what they like, and Elaine is training for the family business, and the boy has won a scholarship at Leeds, and the old lady, who is about his own age, had 3 more children at home, and they have 2 motor cars, but Mr. Morris still mends the boots on Sunday. It is superb. It is absolutely superb, thought Peter Walsh, swaying a little backwards and forwards with his liqueur glass in his hand among the hairy red chairs and ashtrays, feeling very well pleased with himself, for the Morrises liked him. Yes, they liked a man who said Bartlett pears. They liked him, he felt. He would go to Clarissa's party. The Morrises moved off, but they would meet again. He would go to Clarissa's party because he wanted to ask Richard what they were doing in India, the conservative duffers. And what's being acted, and music. Oh yes, and mere gossip. For this is the truth about our soul, he thought, ourself, who fish-like inhabits deep seas and plies among obscurities, threading her way between the bowls of giant weeds, over sun-flickered spaces, and on into gloom, cold, deep, inscrutable. Suddenly she shoots to the surface and sports on the wind-wrinkled waves, that is, has a positive need to brush, scrape, kindle herself, gossiping. What did the government mean, Richard Dalloway would know, to do about India? End of section 25. Section 26. Since it was a very hot night, and the paper boys went by with placards proclaiming in huge red letters that there was a heat wave, wicker chairs were placed on the hotel steps, and there, sipping, smoking, detached gentlemen sat. Peter Walsh sat there. One might fancy that day, the London day, was just beginning. Like a woman who had slipped off her print dress and white apron to array herself in blue and pearls, the day changed, put off stuff, took gauze, changed to an evening, and with the same sigh of exhilaration that a woman breathes, tumbling petticoats on the floor, it too shed dust, heat, colour. The traffic thinned. Motor cars, tinkling, darting, succeeded the lumber of vans, and here and there among the thick foliage of the squares an intense light hung. I resign, the evening seemed to say, as it paled and faded above the battlements and prominences, moulded, pointed, of hotel, flat, and block of shops. I fade, she was beginning, I disappear. But London would have none of it, and rushed her bayonets into the sky, pinioned her, constrained her to partnership in her revelry. For the great revolution of Mr. Willett's summer-time had taken place since Peter Walsh's last visit to England. The prolonged evening was new to him. It was inspiriting, rather. For as the young people went by with their dispatch boxes, awfully glad to be free, proud too, dumbly, of stepping this famous pavement, joy of a kind, cheap, tinselly if you like, but all the same rapture flushed their faces. They dressed well too, pink stockings, pretty shoes. They would now have 2 hours at the pictures. It sharpened, it refined them, the yellow-blue evening light, and on the leaves in the square shone lurid, livid. They looked as if dipped in sea-water, the foliage of a submerged city. He was astonished by the beauty. It was encouraging, too, for where the returned Anglo-Indians sat by rights, he knew crowds of them, in the Oriental Club biliously summing up the ruin of the world, here was he, as young as ever, envying young people their summer-time and the rest of it, and more than suspecting, from the words of a girl, from a housemaid's laughter, intangible things you couldn't lay your hands on, that shift in the whole pyramidal accumulation which in his youth had seemed immovable. On top of them it had pressed, weighed them down, the women especially, like those flowers Clarissa's Aunt Helena used to press between sheets of grey blotting paper, with Littre's dictionary on top, sitting under the lamp after dinner. She was dead now. He had heard of her, from Clarissa, losing the sight of one eye. It seemed so fitting, one of nature's masterpieces, that old Miss Parry should turn to glass. She would die like some bird in a frost gripping her perch. She belonged to a different age, but being so entire, so complete, would always stand up on the horizon, stone-white, eminent, like a lighthouse marking some past stage on this adventurous, long, long voyage, this interminable— he felt for a copper to buy a paper and read about Surrey and Yorkshire. He had held out that copper millions of times. Surrey was all out once more. This interminable life. But cricket was no mere game. Cricket was important. He could never help reading about cricket. He read the scores in the stop-press first, then how it was a hot day, then about a murder case. Having done things millions of times enriched them, though it might be said to take the surface off. The past enriched, and experience, and having cared for one or two people, and so having acquired the power which the young lack, of cutting short, doing what one likes, not caring a rap what people say, and coming and going without any very great expectations. He left his paper on the table and moved off. Which, however, and he looked for his hat and coat, was not altogether true of him, not tonight, for here he was starting to go to a party, at his age, with the belief upon him that he was about to have an experience. But what? Beauty, anyhow. Not the crude beauty of the eye. It was not beauty pure and simple, Bedford Place leading into Russell Square. It was straightness and emptiness, of course, the symmetry of a corridor. But it was also windows lit up, a piano, a gramophone sounding, a sense of pleasure-making hidden, but now and again emerging when, through the uncurtained window, the window left open, one saw parties sitting over tables, young people slowly circling, conversations between men and women, maids idly looking out, a strange comment theirs when work was done. Stockings drying on top ledges, a parrot, a few plants. Absorbing, mysterious, of infinite richness, this life. And in the large square where the cabs shot and swerved so quick, there were loitering couples, dallying, embracing, shrunk up under the shower of a tree. That was moving, so silent, so absorbed, that one passed, discreetly, timidly, as if in the presence of some sacred ceremony to interrupt which would have been impious. That was interesting. And so on into the flare and glare. His light overcoat blew open. He stepped with indescribable idiosyncrasy, leant a little forward, tripped, with his hands behind his back, and his eyes still a little hawk-like. He tripped through London, towards Westminster, observing. Was everybody dining out, then? Doors were being opened here by a footman to let issue a high-stepping old dame in buckled shoes, with 3 purple ostrich feathers in her hair. Doors were being opened for ladies wrapped like mummies in shawls with bright flowers on them, ladies with bare heads, and in respectable quarters with stucco pillars through small front gardens lightly swathed with combs in their hair. Having run up to see the children, women came, men waited for them, with their coats blowing open, and the motor started. Everybody was going out. What with these doors being opened, and the descent and the start, it seemed as if the whole of London were embarking in little boats moored to the bank, tossing on the waters as if the whole place were floating off in carnival. And Whitehall was skated over, silver-beaten as it was, skated over by spiders, and there was a sense of midges round the arc lamps. It was so hot that people stood about talking. And here in Westminster was a retired judge, presumably, sitting foursquare at his house door dressed all in white, an Anglo-Indian, presumably. And here a shindy of brawling women, drunken women, here only a policeman and looming houses, high houses, domed houses, churches, parliaments, and the hoot of a steamer on the river, a hollow misty cry. But it was her street, this, Clarissa's. Cabs were rushing round the corner, like water round the piers of a bridge, drawn together, it seemed to him, because they bore people going to her party, Clarissa's party. The cold stream of visual impressions failed him now, as if the eye were a cup that overflowed and let the rest run down its china walls unrecorded. The brain must wake now. The body must contract now, entering the house, the lighted house, where the door stood open, where the motor cars were standing, and bright women descending. The soul must brave itself to endure. He opened the big blade of his pocket-knife. Lucy came running full tilt downstairs, having just nipped into the drawing-room to smooth a cover, to straighten a chair, to pause a moment and feel whoever came in must think how clean, how bright, how beautifully cared for when they saw the beautiful silver, the brass fire-irons, the new chair covers and the curtains of yellow chintz. She appraised each, heard a roar of voices, people already coming up from dinner. She must fly. The Prime Minister was coming, Agnes said. So she had heard them say in the dining-room, she said, coming in with a tray of glasses. Did it matter? Did it matter in the least? One Prime Minister more or less? It made no difference at this hour of the night to Mrs. Walker among the plates, saucepans, colanders, frying pans, chicken in aspic, ice cream freezers, pared crusts of bread, lemons, soup tureens and pudding basins which, however hard they washed up in the scullery, seemed to be all on top of her, on the kitchen table, on chairs, while the fire blared and roared, the electric lights glared, and still supper had to be laid. All she felt was, one Prime Minister more or less made not a scrap of difference to Mrs. Walker. The ladies were going upstairs already, said Lucy. The ladies were going up, one by one, Mrs. Dalloway walking last and almost always sending back some message to the kitchen. My love to Mrs. Walker, that was it one night. Next morning they would go over the dishes, the soup, the salmon Mrs. Walker knew, as usual, underdone, for she always got nervous about the pudding and left it to Jenny. So it happened, the salmon was always underdone. But some lady with fair hair and silver ornaments had said, Lucy said, about the entree, was it really made at home? But it was the salmon that bothered Mrs. Walker, as she spun the plates round and pulled in dampers and pulled out dampers, and there came a burst of laughter from the dining-room, a voice speaking, then another burst of laughter, the gentlemen enjoying themselves when the ladies had gone. The Tokay, said Lucy, running in. Mr. Dalloway had sent for the Tokay from the Emperor's cellars, the Imperial Tokay. It was borne through the kitchen. Over her shoulder, Lucy reported how Miss Elizabeth looked quite lovely. She couldn't take her eyes off her, in her pink dress, wearing the necklace Mr. Dalloway had given her. Jenny must remember the dog, Miss Elizabeth's fox terrier, which, since it bit, had to be shut up and might, Elizabeth thought, want something. Jenny must remember the dog. But Jenny was not going upstairs with all those people about. There was a motor at the door already. There was a ring at the bell, and the gentleman still in the dining-room, drinking Tokay. There, they were going upstairs. That was the first to come, and now they would come faster and faster, so that Mrs. Parkinson, hired for parties, would leave the hall door ajar, and the hall would be full of gentlemen waiting. They stood waiting, sleeking down their hair, while the ladies took their cloaks off in the room along the passage, where Mrs. Barnett helped them, old Ellen Barnett, who had been with the family 40 years, and came every summer to help the ladies, and remembered mothers when they were girls, and though very unassuming did shake hands, said "Milady" very respectfully, yet had a humorous way with her, looking at the young ladies, and ever so tactfully helping Lady Lovejoy, who had some trouble with her under-bodice. And they could not help feeling, Lady Lovejoy and Miss Alice, that some little privilege in the matter of brush and comb was awarded them, having known Mrs. Barnett. 30 years, milady, Mrs. Barnett supplied her. Young ladies did not use to rouge, said Lady Lovejoy, when they stayed at Burton in the old days, and Miss Alice didn't need rouge, said Mrs. Barnett, looking at her fondly. There Mrs. Barnett would sit in the cloak-room, patting down the furs, smoothing out the Spanish shawls, tidying the dressing-table, and knowing perfectly well, in spite of the furs and embroideries, which were nice ladies, which were not. The dear old body, said Lady Lovejoy, mounting the stairs, Clarissa's old nurse. And then Lady Lovejoy stiffened. Lady and Miss Lovejoy, she said to Mr. Wilkins, hired for parties. He had an admirable manner as he bent and straightened himself, and announced with perfect impartiality, "Lady and Miss Lovejoy, Sir John and Lady Needham, Miss Weld, Mr. Walsh." His manner was admirable. His family life must be irreproachable, except that it seemed impossible that a being with greenish lips and shaven cheeks could ever have blundered into the nuisance of children. "How delightful to see you," said Clarissa. She said it to everyone. "How delightful to see you." She was at her worst, effusive, insincere. It was a great mistake to have come. He should have stayed at home and read his book, thought Peter Walsh. Should have gone to a music hall. He should have stayed at home, for he knew no one. Oh dear, it was going to be a failure, a complete failure. Clarissa felt it in her bones as dear old Lord Lexham stood there apologising for his wife who had caught cold at the Buckingham Palace garden party. She could see Peter out of the tail of her eye, criticising her, there in that corner. Why, after all, did she do these things? Why seek pinnacles and stand drenched in fire? Might it consume her anyhow, burn her to cinders? Better anything, better brandish one's torch and hurl it to earth than taper and dwindle away like some Ellie Henderson. It was extraordinary how Peter put her into these states just by coming and standing in a corner. He made her see herself, exaggerate. It was idiotic. But why did he come then, merely to criticise? Why always take, never give? Why not risk one's one little point of view? There he was, wandering off, and she must speak to him. But she would not get the chance. Life was that. Humiliation, renunciation. What Lord Lexham was saying was that his wife would not wear her furs at the garden party because, "My dear, you ladies are all alike." Lady Lexham being 75 at least. It was delicious how they petted each other, that old couple. She did like old Lord Lexham. She did think it mattered, her party. And it made her feel quite sick to know that it was all going wrong, all falling flat. Anything, any explosion, any horror was better than people wandering aimlessly, standing in a bunch at a corner like Ellie Henderson, not even caring to hold themselves upright. End of section 26. Section 27. Gently the yellow curtain with all the birds of paradise blew out, and it seemed as if there were a flight of wings into the room, right out, then sucked back, for the windows were open. Was it draughty, Ellie Henderson wondered. She was subject to chills, but it did not matter that she should come down sneezing tomorrow. It was the girls with their naked shoulders she thought of, being trained to think of others by an old father, an invalid, late vicar of Burton, but he was dead now. And her chills never went to her chest, never. It was the girls she thought of, the young girls with their bare shoulders, she herself having always been a wisp of a creature, with her thin hair and meagre profile. Though now, past 50, there was beginning to shine through some mild beam, something purified into distinction by years of self-abnegation, but obscured again, perpetually, by her distressing gentility, her panic fear, which arose from £300 income, and her weaponless state. She could not earn a penny. And it made her timid, and more disqualified year by year to meet well-dressed people who did this sort of thing every night of the season, merely telling their maids, "I'll wear so-and-so," whereas Ellie Henderson ran out nervously and bought cheap pink flowers, half a dozen, and then threw a shawl over her old black dress. For her invitation to Clarissa's party had come at the last moment. She was not quite happy about it. She had a sort of feeling that Clarissa had not meant to ask her this year. Why should she? There was no reason really, except that they had always known each other. Indeed, they were cousins. But naturally they had rather drifted apart, Clarissa being so sought after. It was an event to her, going to a party. It was quite a treat just to see the lovely clothes. Wasn't that Elizabeth, grown up, with her hair done in the fashionable way, in the pink dress? Yet she could not be more than 17. She was very, very handsome. But girls when they first came out didn't seem to wear white as they used. She must remember everything to tell Edith. Girls wore straight frocks, perfectly tight, with skirts well above the ankles. It was not becoming, she thought. So with her weak eyesight, Ellie Henderson craned rather forward, and it wasn't so much she who minded not having anyone to talk to. She hardly knew anybody there, for she felt that they were all such interesting people to watch, politicians presumably, Richard Dalloway's friends. But it was Richard himself who felt that he could not let the poor creature go on standing there all the evening by herself. "Well, Ellie, and how's the world treating you?" he said in his genial way, and Ellie Henderson, getting nervous and flushing and feeling that it was extraordinarily nice of him to come and talk to her, said that many people really felt the heat more than the cold. "Yes, they do," said Richard Dalloway. "Yes." But what more did one say? "Hello, Richard," said somebody, taking him by the elbow, and good Lord, there was old Peter Walsh. He was delighted to see him, ever so pleased to see him. He hadn't changed a bit. And off they went together, walking right across the room, giving each other little pats, as if they hadn't met for a long time, Ellie Henderson thought, watching them go. Certain she knew that man's face. A tall man, middle-aged, rather fine eyes, dark, wearing spectacles, with a look of John Burroughs. Edith would be sure to know. The curtain with its flight of birds of paradise blew out again, and Clarissa saw Ralph Lyon beat it back, and go on talking. So it wasn't a failure after all. It was going to be all right now. Her party. It had begun. It had started. But it was still touch and go. She must stand there for the present. People seemed to come in a rush. Colonel and Mrs. Garrard, Mr. Hugh Whitbread, Mr. Bowley, Mrs. Hilbery, Lady Mary Maddox, Mr. Quinn, intoned Wilkin. She had 6 or 7 words with each, and they went on. They went into the rooms, into something now, not nothing, since Ralph Lyon had beat back the curtain. And yet for her own part it was too much of an effort. She was not enjoying it. It was too much like being just anybody standing there. Anybody could do it. Yet this anybody she did a little admire, couldn't help feeling that she had, anyhow, made this happen, that it marked a stage, this post that she felt herself to have become, for oddly enough she had quite forgotten what she looked like. But she felt herself a stake driven in at the top of her stairs. Every time she gave a party she had this feeling of being something not herself, and that everyone was unreal in one way, much more real in another. It was, she thought, partly their clothes, partly being taken out of their ordinary ways, partly the background. It was possible to say things you couldn't say anyhow else, things that needed an effort, possible to go much deeper, but not for her, not yet anyhow. "How delightful to see you," she said. "Dear old Sir Harry. He would know everyone." And what was so odd about it was the sense one had as they came up the stairs one after another, Mrs. Mountain Celia, Herbert Ainsty, Mrs. Dacres, oh, and Lady Bruton. "How awfully good of you to come," she said, and she meant it. It was odd how, standing there, one felt them going on, some quite old, some... What name? Lady Rossiter. But who on earth was Lady Rossiter? "Clarissa!" That voice! It was Sally Seton! Sally Seton! After all these years! She loomed through a mist. For she hadn't looked like that, Sally Seton, when Clarissa grasped the hot water can, to think of her under this roof, not like that. All on top of each other, embarrassed, laughing, words tumbled out, passing through London, heard from Clara Hayden. What a chance of seeing you! So I thrust myself in without an invitation. One might put down the hot water can quite composedly. The lustre had gone out of her. Yet it was extraordinary to see her again, older, happier, less lovely. They kissed each other, first this cheek then that, and Clarissa turned with Sally's hand in hers, and saw her rooms full, heard the roar of voices, saw the candlesticks, the blowing curtains, and the roses which Richard had given her. "I have 5 enormous boys," said Sally. She had the simplest egotism and most open desire to be thought first always, and Clarissa loved her for being still like that. "I can't believe it," she cried, kindling all over with pleasure at the thought of the past. But alas, Wilkins wanted her. Wilkins was emitting in a voice of commanding authority as if the whole company must be admonished and the hostess reclaimed from frivolity, one name. "The Prime Minister," said Peter Walsh. The Prime Minister? Was it really? Ellie Henderson marvelled. What a thing to tell Edith! One couldn't laugh at him. He looked so ordinary. You might have stood him behind a counter and bought biscuits. Poor chap, all rigged up in gold lace. And to be fair, as he went his rounds, first with Clarissa, then with Richard escorting him, he did it very well. He tried to look somebody. It was amusing to watch. Nobody looked at him. They just went on talking, yet it was perfectly plain that they all knew, felt to the marrow of their bones this majesty passing, this symbol of what they all stood for, English society. Old Lady Bruton, and she looked very fine too, very stalwart in her lace, swam up, and they withdrew into a little room which at once became spied upon, guarded, and a sort of stir and rustle rippled through every one openly. The Prime Minister. Lord, Lord, the snobbery of the English, thought Peter Walsh, standing in the corner. How they love dressing up in gold lace and doing homage. There. That must be, by Jove, it was, Hugh Whitbread snuffing round the precincts of the great, grown rather fatter, rather whiter, the admirable Hugh. He looked always as if he were on duty, thought Peter, a privileged but secretive being, hoarding secrets which he would die to defend, though it was only some little piece of tittle-tattle dropped by a court footman, which would be in all the papers tomorrow. Such were his rattles, his baubles, in playing with which he had grown white, come to the verge of old age, enjoying the respect and affection of all who had the privilege of knowing this type of the English public school man. Inevitably one made up things like that about Hugh. That was his style, the style of those admirable letters which Peter had read thousands of miles across the sea in the Times, and had thanked God he was out of that pernicious hubble-bubble, if it were only to hear baboons chatter and coolies beat their wives. An olive-skinned youth from one of the universities stood obsequiously by. Him he would patronise, initiate, teach how to get on, for he liked nothing better than doing kindnesses, making the hearts of old ladies palpitate with the joy of being thought of in their age, their affliction, thinking themselves quite forgotten. Yet here was dear Hugh driving up and spending an hour talking of the past, remembering trifles, praising the homemade cake, though Hugh might eat cake with a duchess any day of his life, and to look at him, probably did spend a good deal of time in that agreeable occupation. The all-judging, the all-merciful might excuse. Peter Walsh had no mercy. Villains there must be, and God knows the rascals who get hanged for battering the brains of a girl out in a train do less harm on the whole than Hugh Whitbread and his kindness. Look at him now, on tiptoe, dancing forward, bowing and scraping as the Prime Minister and Lady Bruton emerged, intimating for all the world to see that he was privileged to say something private, to Lady Bruton as she passed. She stopped. She wagged her fine old head. She was thanking him, presumably, for some piece of civility. She had her toadies, minor officials in government offices who ran about putting through little jobs on her behalf, in return for which she gave them luncheon. But she'd arrived from the 18th century. She was all right. And now Clarissa escorted her Prime Minister down the room, prancing, sparkling, with the stateliness of her grey hair. She wore earrings and a silver-green mermaid's dress. Lolloping on the waves and braiding her tresses, she seemed, having that gift still, to be, to exist, to sum it all up in the moment as she passed, turned, caught her scarf in some other woman's dress, unhitched it, laughed, all with the most perfect ease and air of creature floating in its element. But age had brushed her. Even as a mermaid might behold in her glass the setting sun on some very clear evening over the waves, there was a breath of tenderness. Her severity, her prudery, her woodenness were all warmed through now, and she had about her, as she said good-bye to the thick gold-laced man, who was doing his best, and good luck to him, to look important, an inexpressible dignity, an exquisite cordiality, as if she wished the whole world well, and must now, being on the very verge and rim of things, take her leave. So she made him think, but he was not in love. End of section 27. Section 28. Indeed, Clarissa felt, the Prime Minister had been good to come, and walking down the room with him, with Sally there, and Peter there, and Richard very pleased, with all those people rather inclined, perhaps, to envy, she had felt that intoxication of the moment, that dilation of the nerves of the heart itself, till it seemed to quiver, steeped, upright. Yes, but after all, it was what other people felt that, for though she loved it and felt it tingle and sting, still these semblances, these triumphs, dear old Peter, for example, thinking her so brilliant, had a hollowness. At arm's length they were, not in the heart, and it might be that she was growing old, but they satisfied her no longer as they used. And suddenly, as she saw the Prime Minister go down the stairs, the gilt rim of the Sir Joshua picture of the little girl with a muff brought back Kilman with a rush. Kilman, her enemy. That was satisfying. That was real. Ah, how she hated her. Hot, hypocritical, corrupt, with all that power, Elizabeth's seducer, the woman who had crept in to steal and defile. Richard would say, what nonsense. She hated her. She loved her. It was enemies one wanted, not friends, not Mrs. Durant and Clara, Sir William and Lady Bradshaw, Miss Trulock and Eleanor Gibson, whom she saw coming upstairs. They must find her if they wanted her. She was for the party. There was her dear old friend Sir Harry. "Dear Sir Harry," she said, going up to the fine old fellow who had produced more bad pictures than any other two academicians in the whole of St. John's Wood. They were always of cattle standing in sunset pools absorbing moisture, or signifying, for he had a certain range of gesture, by the raising of one foreleg and the toss of the antlers, the approach of the stranger. All his activities, dining out, racing, were founded on cattle standing absorbing moisture in sunset pools. "What are you laughing at?" she asked him, for Willie Titcombe and Sir Harry and Herbert Ainsty were all laughing. But no, Sir Harry could not tell Clarissa Dalloway, much though he liked her. Of her type he thought her perfect, and threatened to paint her. His stories of the music-hall stage. He chaffed her about her party. He missed his brandy. These circles, he said, were above him. But he liked her, respected her, in spite of her damnable, difficult upper-class refinement, which made it impossible to ask Clarissa Dalloway to sit on his knee. And up came that wandering will-o'-the-wisp, that vagueless phosphorescence, old Mrs. Hilbery, stretching her hands to the blaze of his laughter about the Duke and the lady, which, as she heard it across the room, seemed to reassure her on a point which sometimes bothered her if she woke early in the morning and did not like to call her maid for a cup of tea. How it is certain we must die. "They won't tell us their stories," said Clarissa. "Dear Clarissa!" exclaimed Mrs. Hilbery. She looked tonight, she said, so like her mother as she first saw her walking in a garden in a grey hat. And really Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. Her mother, walking in a garden. But alas, she must go. For there was Professor Brierly, who lectured on Milton, talking to little Jim Hutton, who was unable, even for a party like this, to compass both tie and waistcoat, or make his hair lie flat. And even at this distance they were quarrelling, she could see. For Professor Brierly was a very queer fish. With all those degrees, honours, lectureships between him and the scribblers, he suspected instantly an atmosphere not favourable to his queer compound. His prodigious learning and timidity, his wintry charm without cordiality, his innocence blent with snobbery. He quivered if made conscious by a lady's unkempt hair, a youth's boots, of an underworld, very creditable doubtless, of rebels, of ardent young people, of would-be geniuses, and intimated with a little toss of the head, with a sniff, "Humph!" The value of moderation, of some slight training in the classics in order to appreciate Milton. Professor Brierly, Clarissa could see, wasn't hitting it off with little Jim Hutton, who wore red socks, his black being at the laundry, about Milton. She interrupted. She said she loved Bach, so did Hutton. That was the bond between them, and Hutton, a very bad poet, always felt that Mrs. Dalloway was far the best of the great ladies who took an interest in art. It was odd how strict she was. About music she was purely impersonal. She was rather a prig. But how charming to look at. She made her house so nice if it weren't for her professors. Clarissa had half a mind to snatch him off and set him down at the piano in the back room, for he played divinely. "But the noise," she said, "the noise." "The sign of a successful party." Nodding urbanely, the professor stepped delicately off. "He knows everything in the whole world about Milton," said Clarissa. "Does he indeed?" said Hutton, who would imitate the professor throughout Hampstead, the professor on Milton, the professor on moderation, the professor stepping delicately off. "But she must speak to that couple," said Clarissa, "Lord Gayton and Lancey Blow." Not that they added perceptibly to the noise of the party. They were not talking perceptibly, as they stood side by the yellow curtains. They would soon be off elsewhere, together, and never had very much to say in any circumstances. They looked, that was all. That was enough. They looked so clean, so sound, she with an apricot bloom of powder and paint, but he scrubbed, rinsed, with the eyes of a bird, so that no ball could pass him or stroke surprise him. He struck, he leapt accurately on the spot. Ponies' mouths quivered at the end of his reins. He had his honours, ancestral monuments, banners hanging in the church at home. He had his duties, his tenants, a mother and sisters. Had been all day at Lord's, and that was what they were talking about. Cricket, cousins, the movies, when Mrs. Dalloway came up. Lord Gayton liked her most awfully. So did Miss Blow. She had such charming manners. "It is angelic, it is delicious of you to have come," she said. She loved Lord's, she loved youth, and Nancy, dressed at enormous expense by the greatest artists in Paris, stood there looking as if her body had merely put forth of its own accord a green frill. "I had meant to have dancing," said Clarissa, "for the young people could not talk, and why should they? Shout, embrace, swing, be up at dawn, carry sugar to ponies, kiss and caress the snouts of adorable chows, and then, all tingling and streaming, plunge and swim. But the enormous resources of the English language, the power it bestows after all of communicating feelings, at their age she and Peter would have been arguing all the evening, was not for them. They would solidify young. They would be good beyond measure to the people on the estate, but alone, perhaps, rather dull. "What a pity," she said. "I had hoped to have dancing. It was so extraordinarily nice of them to have come. But talk of dancing! The rooms were packed." There was old Aunt Helena in her shawl. Alas, she must leave them, Lord Gayton and Nancy Blow. There was old Miss Parry, her aunt. For Miss Helena Parry was not dead. Miss Parry was alive. She was past 80. She ascended staircases slowly with a stick. She was placed in a chair. Richard had seen to it. People who had known Burma in the 70s were always led up to her. Where had Peter got to? They used to be such friends. For at the mention of India, or even Ceylon, her eyes, only one was glass, slowly deepened, became blue, beheld not human beings. She had no tender memories, no proud illusions about viceroys, generals, mutinies. It was orchids she saw, and mountain passes, and herself carried on the backs of coolies in the 60s over solitary peaks, or descending to uproot orchids, startling blossoms never beheld before, which she painted in watercolour, an indomitable Englishwoman, fretful if disturbed by the war, say, which dropped a bomb at her very door, from her deep meditation over orchids and her own figure journeying in the 60s in India. But here was Peter. "Come and talk to Aunt Helena about Burma," said Clarissa, and yet he had not had a word with her all the evening. "We will talk later," said Clarissa, leading him up to Aunt Helena in her white shawl with her stick. "Peter Walsh," said Clarissa. That meant nothing. Clarissa had asked her. It was tiring, it was noisy, but Clarissa had asked her. So she had come. It was a pity that they lived in London, Richard and Clarissa. If only for Clarissa's health it would have been better to live in the country. But Clarissa had always been fond of society. "He has been in Burma," said Clarissa. Ah! She could not resist recalling what Charles Darwin had said about her little book on the orchids of Burma. Clarissa must speak to Lady Bruton. No doubt it was forgotten now, her book on the orchids of Burma, but it went into 3 editions before 1870, she told Peter. She remembered him now. He had been at Burton, and he had left her, Peter Walsh remembered, without a word in the drawing-room that night when Clarissa had asked him to come boating. "Richard so much enjoyed his lunch party," said Clarissa to Lady Bruton. "Richard was the greatest possible help," Lady Bruton replied. "He helped me to write a letter. And how are you?" "Oh, perfectly well," said Clarissa. Lady Bruton detested illness in the wives of politicians. "And there's Peter Walsh," said Lady Bruton, for she could never think of anything to say to Clarissa, though she liked her. She had lots of fine qualities, but they had nothing in common, she and Clarissa. It might have been better if Richard had married a woman with less charm, who would have helped him more in his work. He had lost his chance of the cabinet. "There's Peter Walsh," she said, shaking hands with that agreeable sinner, that very able fellow who should have made a name for himself but hadn't, always in difficulties with women. And of course old Miss Parry, wonderful old lady. Lady Bruton stood by Miss Parry's chair, a spectral grenadier, draped in black, inviting Peter Walsh to lunch, cordial, but without small talk, remembering nothing whatever about the flora or fauna of India. She had been there, of course, had stayed with 3 viceroys, thought some of the Indian civilians uncommonly fine fellows, but what a tragedy it was, the state of India. The Prime Minister had just been telling her, old Miss Parry, huddled up in her shawl, did not care what the Prime Minister had just been telling her, and Lady Bruton would like to have Peter Walsh's opinion, he being fresh from the centre, and she would get Sir Sampson to meet him, for really it prevented her from sleeping at night, the folly of it, the wickedness, she might say, being a soldier's daughter. She was an old woman now, not good for much. But her house, her servants, her good friend Millie Brush, did he remember her? Were all there only asking to be used if they could be of help, in short. For she never spoke of England, but this Isle of Men, this dear, dear land, was in her blood, without reading Shakespeare. And if ever a woman could have worn the helmet and shot the arrow, could have led troops to attack, ruled with indomitable justice barbarian hordes, and lain under a shield noiseless in a church, or made a green grass mound on some primeval hillside, that woman was Millicent Bruton. Debarred by her sex and some truancy, too, of the logical faculty, she found it impossible to write a letter to the Times. She had the thought of empire always at hand, and had acquired from her association with that armoured goddess her ramrod bearing, her robustness of demeanour, so that one could not figure her, even in death, parted from the earth, or roaming territories over which, in some spiritual shape, the Union Jack had ceased to fly. To be not English, even among the dead! No, no, impossible! End of section 28. Section 29. But was it Lady Bruton, whom she used to know? Was it Peter Walsh grown grey? Lady Rossiter asked herself, who had been Sally Seton. It was old Miss Parry, certainly, the old aunt who used to be so cross when she stayed at Burton. Never should she forget running along the passage naked and being sent for by Miss Parry. And Clarissa, oh, Clarissa! Sally caught her by the arm. Clarissa stopped beside them. "But I can't stay," she said. "I shall come later. Wait," she said, looking at Peter and Sally. They must wait, she meant, until all these people had gone. "I shall come back," she said, looking at her old friends Sally and Peter, who were shaking hands, and Sally, remembering the past no doubt, was laughing. But her voice was wrung of its old ravishing richness, her eyes not aglow as they used to be when she smoked cigars, when she ran down the passage to fetch her sponge-bag without a stitch of clothing on her. And Ellen Atkins asked, what if the gentleman had met her? But everybody forgave her. She stole a chicken from the larder because she was hungry in the night. She smoked cigars in her bedroom. She left a priceless book in the punt. But everybody adored her, except perhaps Papa. It was her warmth, her vitality. She would paint, she would write. Old women in the village never to this day forgot to ask after your friend in the red cloak who seemed so bright. She accused Hugh Whitbread of all people, and there he was, her old friend Hugh, talking to the Portuguese ambassador, of kissing her in the smoking room to punish her for saying that women should have votes. Vulgar men did, she said. And Clarissa remembered having to persuade her not to denounce him at family prayers, which she was capable of doing with her daring, her recklessness, her melodramatic love of being at the centre of everything, and creating scenes, and it was bound, Clarissa used to think, to end in some awful tragedy, her death, her martyrdom, instead of which she had married, quite unexpectedly, a bald man with a large buttonhole who owned, it was said, cotton mills at Manchester, and she had 5 boys. She and Peter had settled down together. They were talking. It seemed so familiar that they should be talking. They would discuss the past. With the two of them, more even than with Richard, she shared her past. The garden, the trees, old Joseph Bretkoff singing Brahms without any voice, the drawing-room wallpaper, the smell of the mats. A part of this Sally must always be, Peter must always be. But she must leave them. There were the Bradshaws whom she disliked. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw, in grey and silver, balancing like a sea lion at the edge of its tank, barking for invitations, duchesses, the typical successful man's wife. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw and say... But Lady Bradshaw anticipated her. "We are shockingly late, dear Mrs. Dalloway. We hardly dared to come in," she said. And Sir William, who looked very distinguished, with his grey hair and blue eyes, said yes. They had not been able to resist the temptation. He was talking to Richard about that bill, probably, which they wanted to get through the Commons. Why did the sight of him talking to Richard curl her up? He looked what he was, a great doctor, a man absolutely at the head of his profession, very powerful, rather worn. For think what cases came before him, people in the uttermost depths of misery, people on the verge of insanity, husbands and wives. He had to decide questions of appalling difficulty. Yet what she felt was... one wouldn't like Sir William to see one unhappy. No, not that man. "How is your son at Eton?" she asked Lady Bradshaw. He had just missed his 11, said Lady Bradshaw, because of the mumps. His father minded even more than he did, she thought, being, she said, nothing but a great boy himself. Clarissa looked at Sir William, talking to Richard. He did not look like a boy, not in the least like a boy. She had once gone with someone to ask his advice. He had been perfectly right, extremely sensible. But heavens, what a relief to get out to the street again! There was some poor wretch sobbing, she remembered, in the waiting-room. But she did not know what it was about Sir William, what exactly she disliked. Only Richard agreed with her. Didn't like his taste, didn't like his smell. But he was extraordinarily able. They were talking about this bill. Some case, Sir William was mentioning, lowering his voice. It had its bearing upon what he was saying about the deferred effects of shell shock. There must be some provision in the bill. Sinking her voice, drawing Mrs. Dalloway into the shelter of a common femininity, a common pride in the illustrious qualities of husbands and their sad tendency to overwork, Lady Bradshaw, poor goose, one didn't dislike her, murmured how, just as we were starting, my husband was called upon the telephone. A very sad case. A young man, that is what Sir William is telling Mr. Dalloway, had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. She went on into the little room where the Prime Minister had gone with Lady Bruton. Perhaps there was somebody there, but there was nobody. The chairs still kept the impress of the Prime Minister and Lady Bruton. She turned deferentially, he sitting foursquare, authoritatively. They had been talking about India. There was nobody. The party's splendour fell to the floor. So strange it was to come in alone in her finery. What business had the Bradshaws to talk of death at her party? A young man had killed himself, and they talked of it at her party. The Bradshaws talked of death. He had killed himself. But how? Always her body went through it first when she was told, suddenly, of an accident. Her dress flamed, her body burnt. He had thrown himself from a window. Up had flashed the ground, through him, blundering, bruising, went the rusty spikes. There he lay with a thud, thud, thud in his brain, and then a suffocation of blackness. So she saw it. But why had he done it? And the Bradshaws talked of it at her party. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more. But he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. They, all day she had been thinking of Burton, of Peter, of Sally. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered. A thing, wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the centre, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. There was an embrace in death. But this young man who had killed himself, had he plunged holding his treasure? If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she had said to herself once, coming down in white. Or there were the poets and thinkers. Suppose he had had that passion and had gone to Sir William Bradshaw, a great doctor, yet to her obscurely evil, without sex or lust, extremely polite to women, but capable of some indescribable outrage, forcing your soul, that was it. If this young man had gone to him, and Sir William had impressed him like that with his power, might he not then have said, indeed she felt it now, life is made intolerable. They make life intolerable, men like that. Then, she had felt it only this morning, there was the terror, the overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life, to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was, in the depths of her heart, an awful fear. Even now, quite often if Richard had not been there reading the Times, so that she could crouch like a bird and gradually revive, send roaring up that immeasurable delight, rubbing stick to stick, one thing with another, she must have perished. But that young man had killed himself. Somehow it was her disaster, her disgrace. It was her punishment to see sink and disappear, here a man, there a woman, in this profound darkness. And she, forced to stand here in her evening dress. She had schemed, she had pilfered. She was never wholly admirable. She had wanted success, Lady Bexborough and the rest of it, and once she had walked on the terrace at Burton. It was due to Richard. She had never been so happy. Nothing could be slow enough, nothing last too long. No pleasure could equal, she thought, straightening the chairs, pushing in one book on the shelf, this having done with the triumphs of youth, lost herself in the process of living, to find it, with a shock of delight, as the sun rose, as the day sank. Many a time had she gone at Burton when they were all talking, to look at the sky, or seen it between people's shoulders at dinner, seen it in London when she could not sleep. She walked to the window. It held, foolish as the idea was, something of her own in it, this country sky, this sky above Westminster. She parted the curtains. She looked. Oh, but how surprising! In the room opposite, the old lady stared straight at her. She was going to bed. And the sky. It will be a solemn sky, she had thought. It will be a dusky sky, turning away its cheek in beauty. But there it was, ashen, pale, raced over quickly by tapering vast clouds. It was new to her. The wind must have risen. She was going to bed in the room opposite. It was fascinating to watch her moving about, that old lady, crossing the room, coming to the window. Could she see her? It was fascinating, with people still laughing and shouting in the drawing-room, to watch that old woman, quite quietly, going to bed. She pulled the blind now. The clock began striking. The young man had killed himself, but she did not pity him. With the clock striking the hour, 1, 2, 3, she did not pity him, with all this going on. There! The old lady had put out her light. The whole house was dark now with this going on, she repeated, and the words came to her. Fear no more the heat of the sun. She must go back to them. But what an extraordinary night! She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. But she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Sally and Peter. And she came in from the little room. "But where is Clarissa?" said Peter. He was sitting on the sofa with Sally. After all these years, he really could not call her Lady Rossiter. "Where's the woman gone to?" he asked. "Where's Clarissa?" Sally supposed, and so did Peter for the matter of that there were people of importance, politicians, whom neither of them knew unless by sight in the picture papers, whom Clarissa had to be nice to, had to talk to. She was with them. Yet there was Richard Dalloway not in the cabinet. He hadn't been a success, Sally supposed. For herself, she scarcely ever read the papers. She sometimes saw his name mentioned. But then, well, she lived a very solitary life in the wilds, Clarissa would say, among great merchants, great manufacturers, men, after all, who did things. She had done things too. "I have 5 sons," she told him. Lord, Lord, what a change had come over her! The softness of motherhood, its egotism too. Last time they met, Peter remembered, had been among the cauliflowers in the moonlight. The leaves, like rough bronze, she had said, with her literary turn, and she had picked a rose. She had marched him up and down that awful night, after the scene by the fountain. He was to catch the midnight train. Heavens, he had wept. End of section 29. Section 30. That was his old trick, opening a pocket-knife, thought Sally, always opening and shutting a knife when he got excited. They had been very, very intimate, she and Peter Walsh, when he was in love with Clarissa, and there was that dreadful, ridiculous scene over Richard Dalloway at lunch. She had called Richard Wickham. Why not call Richard Wickham? Clarissa had flared up, and indeed they had never seen each other since, she and Clarissa, not more than 6 times perhaps in the last 10 years, and Peter Walsh had gone off to India, and she had heard vaguely that he had made an unhappy marriage, and she didn't know whether he had any children, and she couldn't ask him, for he had changed. He was rather shrivelled-looking, but kinder, she felt, and she had a real affection for him, for he was connected with her youth, and she still had a little Emily Bronte he had given her, and he was to write, surely. In those days he was to write. "Have you written?" she asked him, spreading her hand, her firm and shapely hand, on her knee in a way he recalled. "Not a word," said Peter Walsh, and she laughed. She was still attractive, still a personage, Sally Seton. But who was this Rossiter? He wore 2 camellias on his wedding day. That was all Peter knew of him. "They have myriads of servants, miles of conservatories," Clarissa wrote, something like that. Sally owned it with a shout of laughter. "Yes, I have 10,000 a year." Whether before the tax was paid or after, she couldn't remember. For her husband, whom you must meet, she said, whom you would like, she said, did all that for her. And Sally used to be in rags and tatters. She had pawned her grandmother's ring, which Marie Antoinette had given her great-grandfather to come to Burton. Oh yes, Sally remembered. She had it still. A ruby ring which Marie Antoinette had given her great-grandfather. She never had a penny to her name in those days, and going to Burton always meant some frightful pinch. But going to Burton had meant so much to her, had kept her sane, she believed. So unhappy she had been at home. But that was all a thing of the past, all over now, she said. And Mr. Parry was dead, and Miss Parry was still alive. Never had he had such a shock in his life, said Peter. He had been quite certain she was dead. And the marriage had been, Sally supposed, a success. And that very handsome, very self-possessed young woman was Elizabeth over there by the curtains in red. She was like a poplar, she was like a river, she was like a hyacinth, Willie Titcombe was thinking. Oh, how much nicer to be in the country and do what she liked. She could hear her poor dog howling, Elizabeth was certain. She was not a bit like Clarissa, Peter Walsh said. Oh, Clarissa, said Sally. What Sally felt was simply this. She had owed Clarissa an enormous amount. They had been friends, not acquaintances, friends. And she still saw Clarissa all in white going about the house with her hands full of flowers. To this day tobacco plants made her think of Burton. But did Peter understand? She lacked something. Lacked, what was it? She had charm, she had extraordinary charm. But to be frank, and she felt that Peter was an old friend, a real friend, did absence matter? Did distance matter? She had often wanted to write to him, but torn it up, yet felt he understood, for people understand without things being said, as one realises growing old, and old she was. Had been that afternoon to see her sons at Eton, where they had the mumps. To be quite frank, then, how could Clarissa have done it? Married Richard Dalloway, a sportsman, a man who cared only for dogs. Literally, when he came into the room, he smelt of the stables. And then all this, she waved her hand. Hugh Whitbread it was, strolling past in his white waistcoat, dim, fat, blind, past everything he looked, except self-esteem and comfort. "He's not going to recognise us," said Sally, and really she hadn't the courage. So that was Hugh, the admirable Hugh. "And what does he do?" she asked Peter. He blacked the king's boots or counted bottles at Windsor, Peter told her. Peter kept his sharp tongue still. But Sally must be frank, Peter said. That kiss now, Hugh's. On the lips, she assured him, in the smoking room one evening. She went straight to Clarissa in a rage. Hugh didn't do such things, Clarissa said. The admirable Hugh. Hugh's socks were without exception the most beautiful she had ever seen, and now his evening dress. Perfect. And had he children? Everybody in the room has 6 sons at Eton, Peter told her, except himself. He, thank God, had none. No sons, no daughters, no wife. Well, he didn't seem to mind, said Sally. He looked younger, she thought, than any of them. But it had been a silly thing to do in many ways, Peter said, to marry like that. A perfect goose she was, he said. But, he said, we had a splendid time of it. But how could that be, Sally wondered. What did he mean? And how odd it was to know him and yet not know a single thing that had happened to him. And did he say it out of pride? Very likely, for after all it must be galling for him, though he was an oddity, a sort of sprite, not at all an ordinary man. It must be lonely at his age to have no home, nowhere to go to. But he must stay with them for weeks and weeks. Of course he would. He would love to stay with them. And that was how it came out. All these years the Dalloways had never been once. Time after time they had asked them. Clarissa, for it was Clarissa, of course, would not come. For, said Sally, Clarissa was at heart a snob. One had to admit it, a snob. And it was that was between them, she was convinced. Clarissa thought she had married beneath her husband being, she was proud of it, a miner's son. Every penny they had he had earned. As a little boy, her voice trembled, he had carried great sacks. And so she would go on, Peter felt, hour after hour, the miner's son. People thought she had married beneath her 5 sons. And what was the other thing? Plants, hydrangeas, syringas, very, very rare hibiscus lilies that never grow north of the Suez Canal. But she, with one gardener in a suburb near Manchester, had beds of them, positively beds. Now all that Clarissa had escaped, unmaternal as she was. A snob was she? Yes, in many ways. Where was she all this time? It was getting late. Yet, said Sally, when I heard Clarissa was giving a party, I felt I couldn't not come. Must see her again. And I'm staying in Victoria Street, practically next door. So I just came without an invitation. But, she whispered, tell me, do. Who is this?" It was Mrs. Hilbery looking for the door, for how late it was getting. And, she murmured, as the night grew later, as people went, one found old friends, quiet nooks and corners, and the loveliest views. Did they know, she asked, that they were surrounded by an enchanted garden? Lights and trees and wonderful gleaming lakes and the sky. Just a few fairy lamps, Clarissa Dalloway had said, in the back garden. But she was a magician. It was a park. And she didn't know their names, but friends she knew they were, friends without names, songs without words, always the best. But there were so many doors, such unexpected places, she could not find her way. "Old Mrs. Hilbery," said Peter. But who was that? That lady standing by the curtain all the evening without speaking. He knew her face, connected her with Burton. Surely she used to cut up underclothes at the large table in the window. Davidson, was that her name? "Oh, that is Ellie Henderson," said Sally. Clarissa was really very hard on her. She was a cousin, very poor. Clarissa was hard on people. "She was rather," said Peter. "Yet," said Sally, in her emotional way, with a rush of that enthusiasm which Peter used to love her for, yet dreaded a little now, so effusive she might become. How generous to her friends Clarissa was, and what a rare quality one found it, and how sometimes at night or on Christmas Day, when she counted up her blessings, she put that friendship first. They were young, that was it. Clarissa was pure-hearted, that was it. Peter would think her sentimental. So she was. For she had come to feel that it was the only thing worth saying, what one felt. Cleverness was silly. One must say simply what one felt. "But I do not know," said Peter Walsh, "what I feel." Poor Peter, thought Sally. Why did not Clarissa come and talk to them? That was what he was longing for. She knew it. All the time he was thinking only of Clarissa, and was fidgeting with his knife. He had not found life simple, Peter said. His relations with Clarissa had not been simple. It had spoilt his life, he said. They had been so intimate, he and Sally Seaton. It was absurd not to say it. One could not be in love twice, he said. And what could she say? Still, it is better to have loved. But he would think her sentimental. He used to be so sharp. He must come and stay with them in Manchester. That is all very true, he said, all very true. He would love to come and stay with them, directly he had done what he had to do in London. And Clarissa had cared for him more than she had ever cared for Richard. Sally was positive of that. "No, no, no," said Peter. Sally should not have said that. She went too far. That good fellow, there he was at the end of the room, holding forth, the same as ever. Dear old Richard. Who was he talking to? Sally asked. That very distinguished-looking man. Living in the wilds as she did, she had an insatiable curiosity to know who people were. But Peter did not know. He did not like his looks, he said, probably a cabinet minister. Of them all, Richard seemed to him the best, he said, the most disinterested. "But what has he done?" Sally asked. Public work, she supposed. And were they happy together? Sally asked. She herself was extremely happy, for, she admitted, she knew nothing about them, only jumped to conclusions as one does. For what can one know, even of the people one lives with every day? She asked. Are we not all prisoners? She had read a wonderful play about a man who scratched on the wall of his cell, and she had felt that was true of life. One scratched on the wall. Despairing of human relationships, people were so difficult. She often went into her garden and got from her flowers a peace which men and women never gave her. But no, he did not like cabbages. He preferred human beings, Peter said. Indeed, the young are beautiful, Sally said, watching Elizabeth cross the room. How unlike Clarissa at her age. Could he make anything of her? She would not open her lips. Not much, not yet, Peter admitted. She was like a lily, Sally said, a lily by the side of a pool. But Peter did not agree that we know nothing. We know everything, he said. At least he did. But these two, Sally whispered, these two coming now. And really she must go if Clarissa did not come soon. This distinguished-looking man and his rather common-looking wife who had been talking to Richard. What could one know about people like that? That they're damnable humbugs, said Peter, looking at them casually. He made Sally laugh. But Sir William Bradshaw stopped at the door to look at a picture. He looked in the corner for the engraver's name. His wife looked too. Sir William Bradshaw was so interested in art. When one was young, said Peter, one was too much excited to know people. Now that one was old, 52 to be precise. Sally was 55, in body, she said, but her heart was like a girl's of 20. Now that one was mature then, said Peter, one could watch, one could understand, and one did not lose the power of feeling, he said. No, that is true, said Sally. She felt more deeply, more passionately, every year. It increased, he said, alas, perhaps. But one should be glad of it. It went on increasing in his experience. There was someone in India. He would like to tell Sally about her. He would like Sally to know her. She was married, he said. She had 2 small children. They must all come to Manchester, said Sally. He must promise before they left. There's Elizabeth, he said. She feels not half what we feel, not yet. But, said Sally, watching Elizabeth go to her father, one can see they are devoted to each other. She could feel it by the way Elizabeth went to her father. For her father had been looking at her as he stood talking to the Bradshaws, and he had thought to himself, who is that lovely girl? And suddenly he realised that it was his Elizabeth, and he had not recognised her, she looked so lovely in her pink frock. Elizabeth had felt him looking at her as she talked to Willie Titcombe. So she went to him, and they stood together, now that the party was almost over, looking at the people going, and the rooms getting emptier and emptier, with things scattered on the floor. Even Ellie Henderson was going, nearly last of all, though no one had spoken to her. But she had wanted to see everything, to tell Edith. And Richard and Elizabeth were rather glad it was over, but Richard was proud of his daughter, and he had not meant to tell her, but he could not help telling her. He had looked at her, he said, and he had wondered, who was that lovely girl? And it was his daughter. That did make her happy. But her poor dog was howling. Richard has improved, you are right, said Sally. I shall go and talk to him. I shall say good night. What does the brain matter, said Lady Rossiter, getting up, compared with the heart? I will come, said Peter, but he sat on for a moment. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said. For there she was. The end. End of section 30. End of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf.